Chapter 4 is entitled The Environmental Context, and where we are in the course is illustrated in this graphic. So we started at the outside layer, cultural context. Chapter 3, we talked about microcultures, and now we're at the layer of the environment. The idea here is that conversations take place within a context. And one of those contexts, the outside layer, is the culture of the people involved. The culture might be affected by the fact that one of the participants in that conversation may be a member of a minority group, and that brings with it certain beliefs and values, and also a certain dynamic in terms of the relationship between a member of that particular microculture and the dominant culture. The conversation also takes place in a physical environment, and that also has an effect on how that conversation is going to go, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So the environmental context is important. Obviously, if you're talking indoors versus talking outdoors, you're speaking in a different way. And so all the different contexts, whether it's public or private, whether you're right next to a person or far away, those obviously have influence on the conversation, on the communication process. And this is a good summary of the variety of environmental contexts in which conversations can take place. Streets of Calcutta, the avenues of Brasilia, the left bank of Paris, the gardens of Kyoto, Japan, slums of Chicago, canyons of Lower Manhattan, and we're talking there obviously about so-called built environment and not about natural environments, but obviously even within that those examples there's an awful lot of variation. The concept of information load is one that's important when we're talking about communication within different environments. And what's meant by information load is the information rate, that is to say the amount of information coming at you, if you will, that differs with the different environments in which a conversation takes place. So we have the so-called high load environment, and in the two scenarios that are given at the beginning of Chapter 4, this is the airport scenario where you're in a crowded airport and the environment is very loud, there's a lot going on, there's no predictability in what's going to happen, versus being in your dorm room, which is a low-load environment because it's predictable, it's familiar, you know what's going to happen probably in that room. It's a very simple environment, it's small, and it's comfortable. The higher the information load, the more uncertainty, and therefore the more anxiety. What's the greatest source of uncertainty? Well, it's people, especially if those are people from different cultures. And as a result, folks are likely to avoid high load environments, but there are situations where you can't avoid those kinds of environments, and we're going to see an example from the film Outsourced, where this American businessman has been sent to India, and so he's just arriving in Mumbai and he's exiting the airport. Information load affects us in different ways, and as you can see from that clip, one of the things that can happen is your adrenaline might be running because it's an unfamiliar environment that makes you nervous. It arouses you in unpleasant ways, or it could be in pleasant ways, depending on what the environment is. If it's a low load environment, for example. So that stimulation can be pleasurable, or it can be a deep source of unhappiness and frustration. We also can feel like we're in control of the situation in a low-load environment. So if you're in your dorm room, basically that's an environment that you control, versus being in an airport where obviously you have no control whatsoever. We're going to look at two aspects of the environment in this chapter: the natural environment, or nature, and the built environment, or man-made structures. When you think about how people live, it's clear that the environment has a significant effect on behavior and on cultural values. If you compare, for example, subtropical Africa and Alaska, you have very different environments and very different ways of life in those contrasting environments. So if you live in a very cold environment, you're going to be staying inside, you're going to be huddled together very closely. If you live in a very warm, hot environment, then you're probably going to have a very different structure that you live in, and you're going to be probably spending a lot of time outdoors. So it's clear that climate and environment have a significant impact on human behavior. The example is given in the text of taking a siesta and closing your business in the afternoon because it tends to be very hot, for example, in Southern Europe. The same is true of Mexico. This can be misunderstood sometimes by people from outside the culture. There are different views of nature in different cultures. So one view is that nature is all-powerful and mysterious and unpredictable. This is the world of fairy tales. It goes back to in Germany, these fairy tales were written down in the 19th century, but actually those are old folk tales that go back to a period in Europe when Germany and most of Europe was covered in forests, and there was very little in terms of human habitat, just villages, not really any cities to speak of. And so the overwhelming environment was the forest, which is rather a forbidding environment with a lot more wild animals in it than there are today in Germany. But you can understand this view of nature. There's a very different view in many Asian cultures that have been influenced by Buddhism, where nature is viewed not as opposed to man, but really as man is part of nature, and has to understand and live in harmony with nature. And then there's a view that we have in the West that we can control nature, and we should do that, in fact. There are as well different cultural reactions to natural disasters, and these are outlined, I think, fairly clearly in the text. And if you think about recent natural disasters, kind of interesting to look at what happened in the aftermath of those events. And one of those is the Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that hit Louisiana and Mississippi and flooded New Orleans. This happened despite the number of dikes that were built and along the Mississippi River, a lot of preventative work by the Army Corps of Engineers, and reflects kind of the Western view that it's possible to control natural forces. And in this case, it wasn't. And in fact, New Orleans is still not fully recovered from that disaster. If you compare that to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, it's another huge natural disaster. There wasn't the sense that, well, this is something that we should have been able to prevent, as was the case, I think, after Katrina, but the sense that this is something that we just have to live with, and we have to do the best we can. There wasn't a lot of finger pointing as there was after Katrina, because in Haiti this was just viewed as something that was inevitable. One of the interesting things about natural disasters that's discussed in the text is the different effect that natural disasters have on men and on women, and that certainly is something to be aware of. We're going to talk next about man-made environments, and these obviously reflect the human need for shelter. And Edward Hall has done the pioneering work in this area, as he has done in other areas of intercultural communication, and he lays out three different patterns for how space is arranged in human structures. Fixed space or semi-fixed space, there we're talking about things that can be moved around, or informal space. And he also, Edward Hall did work in terms of looking at how we interact with one another and the distance that we maintain in conversations. And so there's an intimate distance, and then a little further away is personal space, sometimes called arm's length space. Then social space, that we might be together at a party, for example. Although if the party is very loud, that personal space gets shrunk a little bit. And then we have public space. And these are not necessarily universal in terms of the distance maintained. And so in high-touch cultures, for example, in a number of Arab countries, people tend to be closer to one another when they're talking. There's a difference between the personal space in cooler climates versus warmer climates. In small spaces, we tend to increase our physical space. And one of the things that's interesting in terms of physical space that we maintain is how it may be related to the language that we speak. This is something I'm going to be talking about further in Chapter 7, but there have been studies that show that when people use a second language that they've learned, their behavior in terms of the space that they maintain in conversations can vary. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. And if these kind of rules, these informal rules of physical space are violated, this can cause conflict. We'll see a clip here taken from a Seinfeld episode that illustrates what can happen.
This is Erin.
Hello, Erin.
Hello, Erin. So how long are you folks in town?
Oh. 3 more days, and then we're off to Paris.
Ah.
We're going with the Select Charter Group.
I love France. I was just there last year. In fact, you know, I still have an envelope full of French francs. I'll give them to you.
Oh, well, we can't take money.
Oh, no, it's a gift from us.
Oh, that is so nice, Erin. Isn't he nice? So listen, has Jerry been showing you a good time?
No, I haven't.
You know, I have a friend who works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. How'd you like a behind-the-scenes tour?
Really? You could do that?
Easily.
It wouldn't be any trouble?
Of course not.
When could we go?
How about right now?
I'm ready.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay, let me get my coat.
Elaine, what do you say?
Well, I don't think so, Aaron. I have plans.
Oh. How about you, Jerry?
I'm swamped.
You sure? You can examine the artwork up close.
Maybe I'll try and catch up with you.
Oh, yeah, that'll happen.
All right, we're off.
Okay. Bye.
Let's go.
Okay, bye-bye. Have a good time.
Bye.
See everybody later.
Okay.
Bye.
This is the close talker episode from Seinfeld. And what's going on here is that the close talker, Aaron, is violating Jerry's physical space. He's not using what would be appropriate in this context, namely personal space or the arm's length space or social space, which is a little further away, 4 to 12 feet away. Instead, he's getting right up into the face of the people he's talking with, using what would be perceived as intimate space, and this is inappropriate in this context. This is not an official rule, these physical spaces. That's not even something that we're probably aware of, but it's something that we unconsciously do. And we recognize it only when it's violated, as is the case here in this TV show. And here it's done for humorous effect. And the explanation is that this guy is just kind of a strange fellow. He's kind of eccentric in how he talks to people. He's a close talker. But in reality, if someone acted that way, it would probably not be perceived as humorous. It would be perceived as offensive or aggressive. We're going to be taking a look at different cultures in terms of built environments, and I'm not going to be going through these in detail. You have a lot of information in the textbook about some sample cultures, and I'm going to be introducing a few more, and in particular I'm going to be showing you some pictures that I think give a better sense of some of the features that are discussed in some of these cultures. So we're going to start with in Japan. And the traditional Japanese house is quite different in design from American houses in two significant ways. First is that the houses are designed to be flexible living spaces, and this is important particularly because they're designed for multi-generational use, not just for a one family or nuclear family, but extended family. And so if you have a flexible living space that accommodates the growth of the family to have additional relatives move in. The second aspect of Japanese houses that's important is the role of the garden. And the garden is seen as not really something separate from the house, but should be integrated in some way with the house. So we're going to take a look at some pictures of this modular design that's used in Japanese houses, and look at some of the other aspects that are important. But I wanted to show, first of all, a picture that illustrates something that is very important in Japan. And probably as you look at that, you have very little idea of what it is unless you read Japanese. It's a wireless control panel, and it's a wireless control panel for a toilet. It's not something you're likely to see probably in any other country that I'm aware of, but Japanese bathrooms are high-tech, and they're very different. They're environments that where you go beyond the physical functions that are necessary for human life, and it's something where there's a particular ritual attached to how you use a bathroom, and that's true of a lot of aspects of Japanese life. But for one thing, the where the toilet is located is separate from where the bath is located, and the book discusses a little bit the bath etiquette, and it's actually much more involved than what's discussed in the book. But there's also interesting aspect to the toilet side. If you go into a Japanese toilet, you'll see that it's quite different than what we're used to in the United States. For one thing, there's a heated seat. There's a jet of water that can be activated that comes from underneath the seat up towards your bottom. And so this control panel enables you to do a lot of different things with the toilet. Japanese is a very interesting culture. It's very traditional in a lot of ways, but they love gadgets and they love technology. And you can see that in the bathroom. But let's look at some aspects of traditional Japanese house. This is the silk screen, the shoji, that's used to divide up space. Very often these are scenes of nature that are painted on these semi-transparent screens. This is another aspect of making your space configurable and flexible using the tatami. These are mats that you see on the floor that are usually made from bamboo and allow you to restructure the room in various ways. And typically in a lot of Japanese houses you will sleep on the tatami with just minimal futon mattress. This is another aspect of a traditional Japanese house, kind of the ceremonial space, or the kind of the family shrine, the tokonama that you see not only in Japan. You see this also in other Asian cultures as well. Here you see a wall hanging. You might have as well some kind of remembrance of ancestors there. You might have a plant like a bonsai tree, something like that in that space. Here's another culture that's discussed in the text, and here we're talking about Native American culture, the Navajo, and you see this structure, the hogan, which is used in the wintertime. So you see that it's fairly secure. One of the things that I think stands out as you look at this structure is how it's integrated into nature, into the natural environment. It looks like it's just part of nature. This is the Ramada, familiar to us from the hotel, the name from the hotel chain, but this is probably not what a Ramada Inn is supposed to look like. This is a structure that's used in the summer. And so it's not enclosed like the hogan is, and it's a very, very different kind of structure. It's interestingly also not round but square, and the text talks about some of the differences there, that not only between the appearance but the uses of these different spaces. The Marakwet are a tribe who live in Kenya and who live a simple life based on agriculture. You see a family compound here that's made up of the house on the right side, which is made of wattle and daub. Basically, that's sticks and mud with a thatched roof. You see in the background the storehouse. Then there's usually also an animal pen. This is similar to the hogan that we saw for the Navajo, in the sense that it blends very well into nature. Seems to be part of the natural environment. But there are other kinds of, there's a great variety, in fact, of dwellings in Africa, and we're going to take a look at another one, a very different kind of style, in a brief video clip.
Here in Africa, the Ndebele people are renowned for their elaborately patterned homes. Instead of snoozing in the sun, they express the complexity of their human brains with creative acts. They spend hours painting and repainting their houses with meticulously executed abstract designs. They've not merely occupied this territory, they've transformed it. The painted surfaces act like advertising hoardings for the human species, saying we've imposed ourselves on this place, we've brought order here, we've tamed the environment, and we've done this with great effort and skill. This is a status display not just for individual artists, but for the human animal as a whole. Occasionally, even in the modern city, there's a small rebellion against the dead hand of the city planners, and creativity forces its way back onto bleak urban surfaces. Here in Vienna, an Austrian artist was given the opportunity to transform an insipid corner of the city into a work of art. On the Hunterwasser house, each window differs from its neighbours. There are irregular lines everywhere, defying tradition.
One of the aspects of buildings, or the built environment, is that it's obviously primarily used for shelter, but at the same time it offers a venue for human creativity. And in that clip you also saw this house. This is a picture that I took in Vienna a few years ago when I was there. Unfortunately, it was a rainy day, so the picture didn't turn out that well. This is the Hundertwasser house in Vienna. Very interesting design. It doesn't look like your normal urban dwelling. You see all the curves. You can see the fact that each window is different, and you see incorporation of plants and trees. This is an example of the built environment, but that moves in a kind of a different direction.